this conversation around brave expression, even the language of intolerance, etc., it is so interpersonal. It's about how we love. It's about our romantic relationships.
Yeah.
It's about our familial relationships, the roles that we decide to play for other people. And we decide that I have to play this role for as long as I live because it's all this person knows. And we resent ourselves and resent the person for it. We're still self-censoring our expression because expression is not just about what it is you're saying. To me, it's about who you're being, full stop.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of the Terri Cole Show, which I think you are going to love. I had a very illuminating conversation with my pal Africa Brooke, who is a Zimbabwean-born consultant, coach, speaker, and podcaster. She's recognized for her work in overcoming self-sabotage and self-censorship. As the founder and CEO of Africa Brooke International, she provides consulting, coaching, and support to a global audience. She hosts 2 personal development podcasts, Beyond the Self and Unthinkable Thoughts, and is a frequent guest on TV. She's been on this show before, and she wrote a beautiful book called The Third Perspective, Brave Expression in the Age of Intolerance. And I love this book, and I think it's an illuminating and exciting and interesting conversation, and I really hope that you guys enjoy it. Please do. I am so excited to welcome my pal back to the Terri Cole Show, Africa Brooke. Welcome to the Terri Cole Show.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you so, so much. You know what? I'm realizing that it was probably about, and you can correct me, was it 2 years since we last spoke? I think it has been.
At least. I mean,
Gosh.
I don't know. After the pandemic, I have to tell you,
Hmm.
just my whole life is just one time warp,
I know, I know.
right?
Well, it's such a pleasure to be back with you. Thank you so much for having me.
You too. I'm so excited to dive into the topic for today's episode. Really, we're going to be talking about your new book
Mm.
and the importance of the new book is called The Third Perspective, Brave Expression in the Age of Intolerance. You guys, this beautiful book just came out. You want to run and go get it right now because, wow, do we need this now? I have so
Mm.
many questions.
Mm.
But let's just start with the third perspective. Let's just talk about what is it and why is it
Yes.
an urgent and timely conversation?
Yes. And you know what? Since I started writing this book about 3 to 4 years ago, that title, it was not even a title at the time, actually. It was just something that I used to say in conversation, either to friends or to clients, just realizing that, oh my goodness, we're really buying into this lie that we only ever have 2 options, whether as individuals or as a society. You have to pick where you neatly fit into left or right, into being pro, into being anti, or any other illusion of sort of the binary, the 2 options.
Yeah.
But when you speak to everyday people, you realize that most of us, if not all, are there in the middle. We are in that middle way. We are in that third perspective. So to me, the moment that it rolled off my tongue early last year, so early 2023, and I was speaking to a friend of mine and I said it, I knew that's what the book was.
Mhm.
I knew that my work and what I'm trying to do is to invite people into that space where there is nuance, where we don't just talk about a desire for nuance, but we allow ourselves to see that we have so many options available to us.
Mm.
So I think it's to me, this message is not just a nice to have. It's not a let's see what it looks like to express ourselves bravely, to be courageous. We only have to look around at whatever is happening at this moment in time when you're listening to Terri and I speak to realize that we desperately need to find our way to the middle. So to me, the third perspective is that, and it's also an embodiment. I think as human beings, we all embody the philosophy of the third perspective. None of us neatly fit anywhere. We think we do,
Mm-mm.
but we don't. We don't. So that's the essence of the third perspective for me.
What I love about this conversation in the book is the invitation to become more nuanced and become more honest, because that's really what you're
Mm,
really
mhm.
challenging us to do and
Yes.
inviting us to do is to become more thoughtful about the truth about how we feel about things, less reactive, more responsive. But you're really talking about taking the time to know how you feel and what you think. There was something that struck me in the
Mm,
book that I just wanted to talk about before we get into
please.
the other questions. So there was a self-silencing scale. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you can see the
Yes.
book, you can see where it is. This is on page 99.
Mm.
And in the self-silencing scale, it's basically, I'm just going to read a few of the statements. Like we're
Yeah.
basically looking at and saying on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being never and 5 being always, how true are these for you? So the first statement is, I hold my tongue even when I'm bursting with a differing opinion. So you guys listening and watching, just really, I just wanted this really resonated with me. And I really want you to just like sit with it for a sec. The second, group dynamics often overshadow my desire to voice my true feelings. Now, we know this can be very true, especially in family systems. And in the US, we've seen all of this. Listen, it's been divisive for years, but
Yes.
it got really bad with the 2016 presidential election and what was happening with family systems and again, group dynamics. It just reminded me of that statement.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
The third one, before sharing online, I excessively scrutinize my words, fearing potential criticism. Anybody? Hand up. So I love this, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the power in knowing these things. So why did you come up with
Yes.
this scale for us to
I love
figure
that.
out how much we are biting our tongues in life? Let's talk
Yes,
about
I
it.
think that's a beautiful place to start because it all starts with awareness, right? Even when you talk about boundaries and the very extensive work that you do, awareness is a non-negotiable part of it, right? We want to
Yeah.
jump to the execution. What do I say? To be courageous, to be brave, to set boundaries. What do I say? I hold so much empathy and compassion for us as human beings because it's actually a very unnatural thing to self-scrutinize in that way and to go internal. We're sort of external creatures, right? So I wanted to make sure that I'm starting the book with not externalizing, because I think the division and polarization that we're seeing is because we externalize. Other people have the wrong opinion. Other people are problematic. Other people are on the wrong side of history. Other people are intolerant. And even the choice of my subtitle for the book, Brave Expression in the Age of Intolerance, it's kind of like a Trojan horse. And I'll come back to your question, but I think this part is important too. It's sort of a Trojan horse because immediately we'll think, oh, thank God someone is talking about how intolerant everyone else is, you know?
Totally.
Immediately. And believe me, I get it. And then as we get in, you will see that I am inviting you to get curious about your own intolerance, and not even your own intolerance of other people's opinions, of the external world, of the culture war,
Mhm.
of politics, but to say, what is my relationship with self-censorship? Where am I withholding my own speech, my own ideas, my own opinions around a dinner table with my friends, agreeing with things that I don't actually agree with because I'm so intolerant of how I actually feel? And I'm convincing myself that other people are going to be intolerant too. So the
Mhm.
safest option is to self-edit, is to self-scrutinize to the point of self-silencing completely, or overcompensating or fawning, right?
Mhm.
Pleasing other people. So I wanted to make sure that quite early on, I take people through that very reflective exercise. Because if you're someone that is thinking, well, Africa, my problem isn't actually self-censorship, then I still want you to check in to make sure that the way that
Mhm.
you're currently connecting, communicating is working for you. Because some people have an unrefined social filter, right? So this is when they don't actually consider the context of the situation, where they don't think, is this appropriate for now, or could I have this conversation elsewhere? Is this an online conversation or an offline conversation?
Mm.
Am I being reactive or actually being intentionally grounded, responsive in this moment? So there are people that I work with, they tend to be men, interestingly enough, that come to me, but their problem is not actually self-censorship. But I take them through that exact same exercise because if they're intentional and honest enough, as you were saying, they might realize that actually my problem is not self-censorship, but I'm struggling with actually being empathetic in conversations. I'm struggling to allow for other people to speak. I'm struggling to allow for people to disagree with me and for me to not dominate conversations. So
Mhm.
where they end up holding hands, whether you're self-silencing or you don't have a refined social filter, is that it's still leading to ineffective communication and relational breakdown. So for me, that exercise was just very important because I don't want you to do anything, to write anything, just like you were saying, just observe, see what kind of you feel, even somatically, when you read one of those statements, do you reject it?
Mhm.
Oh, that's not me. I don't do that. You know, and is that actually true? So I thought that was a good way to kind of invite people into the fuller conversation to just see where you're at right now.
I love that it's a spectrum. I love that
Yes.
it's both, because when you if we're being inclusive, and you are in this book and in
Mm,
the conversation,
yeah.
it's there's this requirement that it's the people pleasing to the more boundary bullies. And again,
Mm,
doesn't have to be intentional, right? This is just what's happening, and how we're all raised so differently. And there are gender role stuff that I feel like plays
mm,
into this, if we're looking at sort of a traditional, and a lot of this is changing, thank God, but there's still a reality of what exists, which is who's raised to be pleasant and to be
mm.
hopeful and to be compliant, and don't rock the boat, and don't stir the pot, and don't be a pain in the ass, and don't be a loudmouth, and like I could keep going. And a lot of times that is the way little girls are raised. And then
Absolutely.
right, you have on the other side, a lot of time, boys are raised very differently.
Yes. Oh, 100%. And it's something that I'm actually exploring more of that in conversation because again, all of this is it's so layered, right? None of it is simplistic, which is why I resonate so much with your approach to boundaries because you really emphasize that none of this is as simple as cut the other person off. And it's all about like it's not neat in the way that we would
Mm-mm.
like for it to be.
Yep.
So for me, I'm not just saying follow these steps and you'll be brave in your expression. I'm saying that there's so much historical context inside you and outside of you, but you are not
Mhm.
as out of control as you're made to believe. And our culture makes us think that
Yeah.
we absolutely have to comply. We cannot ask hard questions, not even to ourselves, to say, do I actually agree with that thing that I was standing so firmly in a couple of weeks ago?
Hmm.
It's no longer about other people, asking other people tough questions. It's almost like you can't reflect and change your mind yourself, which is where the self-censoring comes in. But
Right.
I just want people to feel hopeful and courageous because I think there's almost this contagious hopelessness that is going around when some of these
Hmm.
conversations are had. But I
Hmm.
think it is so possible, especially when we zoom back in and realize that we don't have to try and change it all. Just try and change things in a very micro way, those micro interactions with people, where in
Hmm.
one instance you would have agreed with something you don't actually agree with, and
Hmm.
realize in that moment that you're sort of at a crossroads, you get to change a tiny part of yourself to say, actually, I don't have an opinion on that. I don't know how I feel on that. How about you?
Yep.
Like this, so it doesn't have to be this big, audacious thing. Because I think sometimes we think it has to be a big moment. So we scare ourselves before we even begin.
Hmm. Right. But part of what you're also inviting us to think about is that you're allowed to not know. You're allowed to
Yes.
think about it. You're allowed to say exactly what you just said. I need to think, or I'm not sure. And I think that I see this in my therapy practice, where
Mm.
we can be very attached to our judgments and our opinions. And we can think that those things, they're our identity. But
Yes.
beliefs can change, right? Thoughts can change.
Absolutely. And I write about this actually in one of the chapters where I talk about the fact that when you're so deeply wed to a belief, particularly, and especially when that belief is then attached to an identity. So let's say, for example, because especially in the US in the lead up to elections, etc., the kind of energy of, even though people are not directly saying it, you can anticipate that you are going to be forced to pick a side and take some kind of firm position as if it's that simple. So
Yeah.
if you're completely wedded to being, let's say, a conservative, and it shapes your belief system and your historical context and how you were raised, you have to be very careful about those labels because it can mean that you don't allow yourself to see things in a different way, to say, actually, no, I agree with whatever's happening on this side in this
Hmm.
specific context. you rob yourself of the chance of seeing things on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
So I speak about that quite a lot, in the sense that our beliefs and our opinions are not the same. Our beliefs tend to firmly shape our identity.
Right.
And we do have to check in on those, because we think just because I've had them for 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, that
Hmm.
you have to commit for a lifetime, but you get to change them. And also,
Yes.
your opinions are then shaped by your beliefs. So everything is ever changing. And I think it's a refreshing thing for people to know, because for some reason, and you can tell me what you think, Terri, but I think for some reason we truly are starting to believe that we can't change our minds, that there's
Mm.
something quite shameful in changing our minds and saying, I don't agree with that anymore. Or to even say that I had it wrong and I'm realizing that I had it wrong. There's
Yeah.
so much shame. Or do you think it's simplistic to say it's shame? But I think it's the thing that we hold on so tightly to our belief system and the identity that comes with it, and changing any of that feels even like a betrayal of sorts.
And yes, I agree. I think though that it depends, because part of what happens is that
Mm,
if you look at the pandemic as a perfect example,
yeah.
there were people who were pro-vax, anti-vax. There were people who were staying in their small pods and people who were traveling and doing their thing. And it was like there was so much reactivity because there was so much fear that it was almost like if you changed your mind, you might
Mm.
get kicked out of your tribe. Basically, of course,
Right.
that's like that's kind of like the base visceral fear. And one of the Boundary Boss Bill of Rights is that you have the right to make mistakes, to course correct, and to change your mind. And I
Mm,
find that exactly what you said is true, that I, for sure, when I was younger, before I had lots and lots of therapy on all this stuff around boundaries and identity, I really felt like I always stayed in relationships a million years longer than I should have. Like, I knew I
mm.
wanted to break up with someone, I would literally say another 3 years,
Yes.
feeling like I committed, I have to stay, or I felt like I was losing something, or being like a bad person to change my mind. And I think the nuance that you're bringing out now about it requires a certain amount of courage to just tell the truth about you've changed, you've evolved.
Mm.
Isn't that what we're doing here?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Which is why, and I really, now more than ever, I make sure that I emphasize this in my work and in my book, that this conversation around brave expression, even the language of intolerance, etc., it's not by default political. It is so interpersonal. It's about how we love. It's about our romantic relationships.
Yeah.
It's about our familial relationships, the roles that we decide to play for other people. And we decide that I have to play this role for as long as I live because it's all this person knows. And we resent ourselves and resent the person for it. We're still self censoring our expression, because expression is not just about what it is you're saying. To me, it's about who you're being, full stop.
Yep.
Even on a simpler level, on a more day-to-day example, how you dress, I speak to so many women, even women that I work with, who through further conversation you discover they want to adorn their body in a certain way. They might want to cut their
Mhm.
hair. I had a woman that I was working with for about 3 years. She's in her late 40s. She's a
Mhm.
beautiful Arabic woman and she's a lawyer. And she was talking about how she used to love red lipstick when she was younger. And then an uncle said to her that it looked slutty, that it
Mhm.
was not a morally correct thing to do for a young girl to wear red
Mm.
lipstick.
Mm.
So she never allowed herself, not even to wear red lipstick, to wear any lipstick ever again. But it's something
Mm.
that she truly desired to do. So in our conversations around self-censorship and expression, because we just open so many doors that go beyond the political, the societal,
Right.
business, whatever. And she was saying to me, she realizes that she's been censoring that part of herself, but it's actually not about
Mm.
the lipstick. It's because it's her creativity, it's her wildness, it's her femininity, it's her
Yeah.
sensuality,
Yep.
that she decided to cast into the shadows, that she was told is this dirty thing.
Yeah.
So
Shame.
she's comfortable, right? So she's comfortable expressing herself with words. I mean, she's a top lawyer. She's an incredible woman. And yet she's censoring a big aspect of herself. And I remember giving her a little challenge of putting on this red lipstick, not to go outside or anything, but just for
Mhm.
herself in the mirror and to see how it feels to have it on for an hour. And then the first day was an hour. And then a couple of days later, she had it on for a few hours. And then a few hours over the course of other days. And then she ended up going to the supermarket without even realizing that she had it on. And she's been
Mm.
wearing it pretty much every day ever since.
I love
So
it.
I'm getting goosebumps as I think about that, because I really want people to know that when I talk about brave expression in the age of intolerance, don't simplify what that means. It's expression in all forms, your silent expression, your verbal expression. I talk about body language a lot in the book, because even
Mm.
how you hold yourself speaks volumes, because we censor this thing. If you have a part of you that wants to be seen and you desire to be seen, you desire to be given compliments or people to recognize you or to be
Mhm.
affirmed in some way, but you think it's bad to want that, you think it's narcissistic to want that, you think it's
Mhm.
egoic to want that, your body language will make sure you don't do that. Otherwise you become all of those things. So I think it can be such a beautiful and quite exciting thing to kind of look at, oh, where else am I sort of really subtly and secretly censoring myself? That has nothing to do with words. The
Right.
words, I kind of think that's the easy part a lot of the time, but it's
Mhm.
the things that we do without even recognizing we're doing it. The outfits that we say, oh, I can't wear that, I'm too old. Or I can't do this. No, I can't have that haircut. I'm not 20 anymore.
Yeah.
Where are you censoring your general expression? So that's also a door that I like opening and inviting people to step into as well.
I love that so much because really you have to slow down with the
Yeah.
content of this book and the content of this conversation that you're bringing to Light Africa. We have to slow down and
Yes.
really self-reflect. Like,
Yes.
where am I being like your client was? Because I'm
Mm,
sure that's something that had happened so long ago for her that you don't even remember why you're not wearing
no,
lipstick,
no.
right? You're like, oh, this is how I am. My clients will use language like, they're very, many of them enmeshed with their families or very identified
Mm,
with their families. And they'll be like, well, we are people like, well, we
mm,
are. And I'll always say, but how are you? What are you like? What kind of a person are you? Like, this groupthink can be,
mm.
I don't know. I mean, it's very indoctrinated in many family systems and other
Yes.
groups too, socially as well. So I feel
Yes.
like this brave expression that you were inviting us to look at, there's so many places that we're hiding and not bravely expressing ourselves, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that you're speaking to the importance of slowness with all of this, because I think it's even with books, right? I mean, we're inundated with so much, whether it's books and podcasts and courses and things, and constantly wanting to refine and make things better to become. But I really, even for myself, I always remind myself that there's actually no rush. There is no rush with any of this. I get to actually read and to digest and to integrate and to experience and to put it down and to revisit. There's no point of arrival. You don't arrive to this
Right.
place called Brave Expression and you get a certificate and there's confetti. And it would be nice, actually, as I say it, I would kind of want to go there. But that place doesn't exist. It exists in the micro moments where you make a little decision to do something differently, a little decision to dress in the way that you actually want. And then maybe the next day you revert a little bit, but then you try again and you do it and you do it and you do it. So I like to remind people that none of this is about, here are some steps to change everything and then it will, there's no such thing. This is where I connect with your work deeply, because there isn't this illusion that you will get to a point of arrival.
Right.
It's a
No,
it's a constant thing, and even in the language of constant, it doesn't mean that it has to be dreary and heavy and this thing that we're doing.
sure.
I think it's curiosity as well, right? Because I think curiosity is a dying art. Being curious about yourself, other people, and just the world around you, and being like,
Hmm.
that's interesting. How can I change that? Did that feel good? Is that working? Is that not? Do I
Right.
really believe that? Like a almost childlike characteristic that we've lost.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I think it really requires conscious and intentional effort
Mm,
to slow down, to become self-reflective, to
Yes.
become, Deepak would talk about, becoming the observer without judgment. And
Yes.
how do we look and go, huh, that is really interesting. That was my reaction. That person said this. I did not agree with what they said. They were asking me my opinion, and I just self-abandoned. I just didn't tell the truth. I just agreed with them.
Yes.
I was going along to get along. Why? And you might be able to reveal that you had a parent this person reminded you of a very
I
punitive
know.
parent, and you got afraid, and whatever it is, like it's not about the judgment, as you're saying. It's not about being wrong. It's about how I see it, and why this work is so important is that if we're not doing this, if we are not expressing ourselves bravely and truthfully, then literally the world is going without our unique gifts and talents that we have to
Mhm.
offer, because the only
Mhm.
way we can really offer them is if we tell the truth. So I want
Yeah.
to ask you personally,
Yeah.
what in your life, what in your background, what in your history brought you to this very
Mm.
powerful but very specific work on self-expression?
Yeah. That's a really beautiful question, because I think that my historical context there is really, really important, because all of this, and I mean all of this, Terry, was so beautifully accidental. It all started because I just needed to get well. And we explored that a little bit in our previous conversation, but I needed to get sober. I needed to get sober from about the age of 14 is when I started drinking quite heavily from the get-go, binge
Mhm.
drinking, which inevitably led to blackout drinking every single time. And I'm not saying that in a hyperbolic way. That's just what
Mhm.
was happening because of
Mhm.
how much and how fast I was drinking. And because of the culture here in the UK, I think the drinking culture in the UK and US is a little bit different in that here it's very, alcohol is a part of everything. And it's almost seen as a
Mhm.
rite of passage that you will go through a phase of binge drinking. It's just pub culture, bar culture
Right.
everywhere, everywhere. Um, so I was able to really go under the radar for a long time with my addiction from the age of 14 up until 24, because it was just seen as a rite of passage. It's something
Sure.
everyone does. And I had no idea that not everyone blacks out each time they drink, but I did.
Mm.
And I would say at 19 is when I started to notice that the addiction was becoming quite serious. It was no longer just like a fun time party thing. I didn't drink by myself, but when I did drink, there was no off button. I
Mhm.
couldn't, even just the idea of having one just did not make sense to me.
Mhm.
So I've always been someone that just I love learning, I love reading, I love understanding why things work in the way that they do. I've always been very curious. I found
Mhm.
myself in environments from young age that didn't really embrace curiosity, just culturally. And also I grew up in an abusive home. My father was an alcoholic too. So I
Mm.
ended up essentially replicating his pattern as I was getting older. It's that thing, of some people in the family, especially children of addicts, they'll either replicate the pattern or they'll completely reject it and decide to go the opposite direction.
Mhm.
So my siblings, two older sisters, one younger brother, they rejected it completely and I leaned into it. So at 19, I came across the term self-sabotage as I was researching and wanting to understand what was wrong with me. Why do I keep
Mhm.
finding myself in this cycle? Why do I lose so many hours every single time that I drink, because I would black out for at most 6 to 8 hours of not having any idea of what has happened. But 19 up until 24, I relapsed so many times, 7 times specifically. And it's always important for me to add that when I say relapse, I'm not talking about saying I'm never drinking again and then going out for a drink the next day. I'm talking about going through long stretches of not drinking, going through recovery, trying to get well, and then pulling the plug. So that language of self sabotage, which had come across, had been embedded in my mind from such a young age. And I was so curious about it because finally it could stop being a moral thing. I could
Mm.
understand that alcohol was doing something very specific to my brain, but I was
Yeah.
also very used to chaos. So each time my life would be
Mm.
stable and things were actually going well and things were working out, I would have this instinctual pull to just make everything collapse because I knew what to do. When things collapsed in destruction, I had the adrenaline to make things right again, whether it's apologizing, lying, and saying that I didn't mean to do this. That was
Hmm.
familiar, you know.
Yeah.
Eventually, that pattern repeated for quite a while. And then at 24, I decided to try getting sober once more. And again, I had been slowly dipping into the world of psychology, wanting to understand, realizing, okay, there's really something here that goes beyond my own personal decision. There's something that's happening on a brain-based level, right? I started
Hmm.
to understand the alcohol industry a little bit more. And the thing that helped me, I truly believe this, in getting sober was to share my story. Because if I kept my story in the shadows, it also made it easier to relapse. There was no
Yeah.
accountability.
Right.
So, in sharing my story, that was my first sort of dance with brave expression. Because,
Mhm.
especially at 24, 9 years ago, sobriety wasn't this marketable, brandable, sexy wellness sort of thing. It was still in the shadows, it was still in the
Yeah.
basements of churches and town halls. And that was also an important part of my story, going to a few meetings, but I didn't resonate with standing up each time and saying, I am an addict and I'm powerless to alcohol. I didn't believe
Hmm.
that I was powerless. I knew that anything that comes after I am is being embedded into my identity and my sense of self. So I'm still
Hmm.
so grateful for those rooms, but it just never resonated in that way.
Hmm.
And so that I would say the area of recovery was my first sort of recognition that I was doing something so brave and stepping forward and saying, I have been struggling with this thing and I refuse to hide anymore. I refuse to relapse behind closed doors. I refuse to live in shame and to believe that I'm bound to this forever. And then my work evolved from studying self-sabotage and being trained in Jungian psychology because I
Hmm.
realized that all of this was about the shadow. It was a deep need to integrate my shadow. Otherwise, it was going to rear its head over and
Hmm.
over and over again. And then over 9 years, Terri, it's just become a fusion of so many different things where I specifically focus now on self-sabotage, but the psychology of collective sabotage, which we call cancel culture, and
Hmm.
self-censorship. So it's sort of there was no blueprint for anything that I do now, but its origins was me needing to get well and me realizing that hiding that need to get well was not going to serve me in any way. That was a form of self sabotage in and of itself, to make myself do it in private so that I don't embarrass myself, so that I don't embarrass my family. I realized that even things like cancel culture, and again, I prefer to use the language collective sabotage because I believe it's much more accurate to the experience. I believe that
Yeah.
it's individuals who are in a state of self sabotage and a lot of the time self rejection, self abandonment, resentment, rage, and anger and confusion and an inability to hold their contradictions. So they project that onto other people.
Right.
So when we come together as those individuals, we become the collective and we end up going against our own best interests. So I could have never imagined that my path would end up here, but
Mhm.
yeah, it has.
But here you are. I thank
Yeah.
you so much for sharing that story, though, because I feel like that it's such a, when you want to talk about self-sabotage and
Hmm.
self-censorship and talk about not being truthful. I mean,
Yes.
well, you also know I'm in recovery, and that the
Yes.
years of blacking out and all the things that you describe very resonate,
Yeah.
and doing it so young, because I was probably 12 when I started. And I
Oh,
think that, and I
wow.
stopped at 22, actually. So you
Oh,
started at 14
wow.
and stopped at 24. But there really is something so powerful about realizing that the antidote to so much of that is the truth, and is
Mm,
brave expression, and is all of what you are teaching us in this beautiful book, baby. And I have
thanks.
another question for you.
Yes.
And this is actually about boundaries. I might have asked you this last time, but I
Mm,
feel like it probably has changed. So we'll see. So, personally, what has been your most challenging boundary struggle, and how did you overcome it, if you have?
mm. Immediately, something came to mind that I wouldn't have thought would come to mind in this conversation. Probably one of the biggest boundaries I put forward wasn't just to one person, actually. It was to different partners through sobriety. I always used to put up with painful sex in intimacy with men because I
Mhm.
felt like saying that this doesn't feel good, this is painful,
Yep.
would be ruining the moment, making them feel small, or that
Mhm.
they would just see me in a different way. They wouldn't see me as the girl that's easy to get along with, you know, the
Yeah.
girl that's kind of just like fun and laid back and, you know. So
Yeah.
I really had this story from a young age because at 14, alcohol and sex were so linked,
Yeah.
deeply interlinked. So getting sober showed me that I was putting up with just genuinely painful, pornified sex that did not feel good, that felt very degrading. And I tried putting up with it for a little while in sobriety because I thought maybe I'm just not connected to my sexuality.
Right.
You know, maybe it's me. But that wasn't the case. When I removed my own sexual shame and started exploring tantra and really respecting my own internal boundaries, the ones that have nothing to do with anyone else, that was probably one of the biggest ones that I had to put forward because it's almost as if I was putting forward boundaries with my father who was physically abusive. It's almost as if I was putting forward boundaries with any man that I had encountered before and would encounter to say, actually, no, you know, so that one, and I have a feeling so many women and even men listening to this will resonate with that because it's such a tender, vulnerable one. But I would say that's it.
That is such a beautiful share. Thank you for sharing it because
Mm,
really that's something that I think that just being able to give expression to
yes.
the truth that
Yes.
you have a right to those boundaries and you have a right to say no and you have a right to say I don't like that.
And a right
And
to pleasure, a right to
yes,
pleasure, right?
yes. And I think you're very insightful in knowing that there was a repeating relationship reality, I
Mhm.
would call it, happening where
Yes.
pain and love went together with your relationship with your father, right? So it makes so much sense. And
Mm.
what a beautiful boundary and what a beautiful reclamation of your own sexuality, sensuality, pleasure, and power, right? Like it's
Mm,
empowering, right? To be like, hey, that's not for me.
absolutely. And also, it was a shattering of so many stories that I had because each
Mm,
man that I expressed to was like, oh my goodness, of course, you should have told me. Let's change it. I had a
yeah.
story that they would abandon me, reject me, think
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
no fun, but none of that was true. In just a moment, it was like, okay, no, let's try what you want to do. And I was like,
Mm.
oh wow, you know. So yeah, that was probably one of the most powerful. And then it started to inform everything else that
Oh,
had nothing to do with sex, you know.
yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The ripple effect is so powerful, though, Africa. That ripple
Man.
effect, because if you can do it there in that very, what feels like a very threatening situation,
Mm-hmm.
it just, and nothing bad happens. And in fact, the opposite
Mm,
happened where people wanted to consider you. Those partners wanted to consider you. It's
yes.
so interesting. Like when we don't tell the truth or are not fully self-expressed, as we're talking about in
Yes.
this book, it's like we are literally denying the people in our lives the opportunity to
Mm,
step up for us.
mm.
We're assuming the worst of them, you know?
Yes. Yes.
What a
Oh, that
beautiful
that that
story.
feels big in my body. Thank you so much for articulating that. That's exactly it.
I love
Mm.
it. All right, tell us all the things. Where can we get this beautiful book? You guys, the book is out. It is called The Third
Yes.
Perspective, Brave Expression in the Age of Intolerance by my pal Africa Brooke right here. You can see it if
Mm.
you're looking. Beautiful. So tell us, where do we get all the things and where can they find you?
Oh, it sounds so good when you say it. It sounds so. I'm gonna take that clip, that little clip, and make it my ringtone. Um, you can find it in any book at any booksellers, so all the big main ones online. But really, I really do want to invite you to support your independent bookstores because
Yeah.
they absolutely need it. We need to
Yep.
support our independent booksellers. But you
Yes.
can find the third perspective everywhere. And allow for yourself to have the experience of walking into a bookstore and buying it and physically walking out with it. And you can find me on Instagram. It's my main platform, Africa Brooke with an E at the end. And if you find any impersonators on the way, help me take down my evil twin. Thank you. And also, there's my website, africabrook.com. If anything resonates, I also have my email on there, which is hello@africabrook.com. I don't want these conversations to stay isolated in these little moments in time on our phones. If anything connects, just send me a message. We can have a little chat about it as well, because I always want to know what people's real life experiences are. But Terri, thank you so, so much for having me. It's a pleasure, a pleasure, a pleasure to be back with you.
Thank you so much for being here. I super appreciate you.